Hi, my name's Daly. I'm a Professor of Economics here at the University of Canberra, and it's almost 40 years since I did my undergraduate degree in economics, and I still find it a really fascinating subject. There's lots of interesting stuff and lots of interesting applications for economics. I guess it can be applied to sort of general big picture stories like what the global financial crisis, how we might manage that. Also, economic analysis is applied to right down to marriage and children and family. So there's a whole range of things, and it can also be just used in people's daily lives. So I think that economics provides a framework for looking at a whole range of questions. And the number of people who are actually employed as professional economists is going to be much smaller than the number of people who have an economics degree or have some sort of economic background. You'll find economists among business people, public servants, academics, managers, all sorts of occupations. And many of the disciplines that are taught in business schools have got as part of their basis economics. So marketing is an example, international business is another one, accounting uses the basic economic national accounts frameworks. So all of these things have got underlying them an important economics component. I've spent most of my working life in economic research or in academia teaching. So that's my particular area of expertise, but I've also done some consulting work. So I've seen what it looks like in some of the big public service departments, for example, but also in private industry. I've done consulting work for some of the big banks and people like that. So I would like to just run through some of the key concepts, of economic thought, but very quickly, of course, because I think these sorts of values are things that permeate the way economists think about the world. And they're also going to be used in lots of applications. So I guess the first one is the idea of opportunity cost, the idea that there's always something else you could be doing. Instead of watching this video, you could be off having a swim or having a drink with your friends or whatever. There is an opportunity cost in everything you do. And secondly is the idea of utility. And utility is really talking about people's satisfaction. It's broader than the idea of a monetary benefit. It includes all non-monetary benefit as well. So I might receive benefit from doing someone else a favour, which isn't a financial benefit, but still I make the calculation that this is something that's worthwhile doing. People respond to incentives. So people like to do things that make them feel better. So if there's an opportunity to make yourself better off, people are more likely to do that than something that might be for the greater good or have maybe long-term benefits, but in the short term you can still see that this would be this outcome is the thing for you at the moment. It might not be in your long-term interest, and you prefer benefits in the short run to the long run. So because people are utility maximisers by assumption, they do things to make themselves better off, they will respond to incentives, and they're in the best position to decide what they want. So I might think it's good for you to give up smoking. But if you personally derive a lot of pleasure from smoking, you might decide in the short run you want to smoke. There might be longer run implications, but in the short run you will make that decision. So people can choose these things. In a lot of the policy analysis in economics, we've got the idea of the gainers being able to compensate the losers for any change in policy. And I'm going to use an example a bit later about that, but if you think of something like what's happening in the car industry in Australia at the moment. There are people who are going to lose when the car industry closes, and there are people that are going to gain when it closes. And we've got to see whether the gainers can compensate the losers, whether this is a worthwhile thing to be doing. Another thing that economists are very gung-ho about is the idea of markets, that markets are much better at allocating goods and services than in a command economy. Here, think of the example of the old USSR, now 20 years since it's existed, where there was a central planner who decided how many pairs of jeans, how many lumps of steel, how many bits of military equipment were produced, and that's what happened. And so there was a huge black market because consumers still wanted Levi jeans and cool boots and things like that, but that wasn't what the USSR central planner was producing. What economists like is for the market to be operating and to be sending out price signals that encourage producers to produce more of the goods where the prices are going up and less of the goods where the prices are going down. So this preference for markets is a very strongly held preference of many economists. I am personally perhaps not such a market person as some of my colleagues or some economists, but I can still see there are huge benefits in the market. It's a very easy way, cheap way of allocating resources. But markets don't always lead to the best social optimal outcomes. And there's lots of examples of where governments intervene in the market in order to try and produce what is a socially preferred system. So one example of that in Australia would be the provision of universal healthcare. You could have a system where, just like in buying a car, we don't provide everyone with a nice car, but we do provide everyone with the basic health services that they require. And that's a political decision. And that was a political decision that was made 30 years ago, plus that we were going to have a universal health system. And we then have the economist's problem is, well, what is the most efficient way of satisfying that democratically recorded wish to have a universal healthcare system? There's also progressive income tax is another example of where society has said, well, we want to redistribute income from the very rich to the not so rich, so we're going to tax the wealthier more heavily than we tax the people on low incomes. That's an example of where the government intervenes in the market system to produce what we think is going to be a socially preferred outcome. Environmental regulations are another example. So you can't just go out as a professional fisher person in the barrier reef and catch as many fish as you want to. There are very strict licensing requirements for anybody who wants to fish in that area. So there we have an intervention in the market where we're trying to make the market produce socially better outcomes. The economy is a really complex organism and it's changing all the time, and so shocks to the system can have unexpected consequences. So if you do something like the last Labor government removed the fringe benefit tax exemption for vehicles, that had implications for sales of cars, and they didn't like that. The car manufacturers, the new coalition government has reintroduced the benefits as a way of trying to boost the car industry, but that's another issue. So I want to just talk about a few ideas, and these are sort of the values of economists in general. But the old joke, ask two economists, you'll get 5 opinions. There's a whole range of economic views. And the thing about economics is that it is a way of thinking. So you can apply it, given your particular viewpoint that you start from, you can apply an economic model to the question that you're looking at given the outcome that you want to achieve, whether it might be a sort of more egalitarian outcome or a more perhaps right-wing conservative outcome where the winners lose because they're the best, where the winners gain because they're the best, that sort of idea. So it was the 19th century British historian Thomas Carlyle who first coined the phrase the dismal science to refer to economics, and this was in his discussion of the West Indian slave trade at the time. And so I'm going to just quote a little bit from him, because I think it's quite interesting that some of his ideas, which are now sort of 150 years old plus, are still what people feel about economists. So he argued that economics was dismal because it finds the secret of this universe in supply and demand, and reducing the duty of human governors to that of letting people alone. So he wanted a more interventionist role for the government, and he was a conservative. He had a more deterministic view of people's place in the social order. If you were born as a slave, you felt you should stay as a slave. And some of that argument that he was using all that time ago is still used by people when they think about economics. So think of an example here of low pay for childcare workers and aged care workers. So you'll hear people say things like, they should be paid more. They make a real contribution to society. What they do is really valuable. So these words, should and ought, come into that sort of argument. But the economists will say, well, we've got supply and demand, and the reason why these people are not paid very well is that supply and demand is equilibrated at a lower wage. And it's not a moral, we're not making a moral judgment, we're just saying, well, that's the way it goes. And really, in a real discussion of the position of these workers, you need to get into a more sophisticated sort of argument where you look at the role of the government and the institutions in determining the pay that they receive. But still, at the core of it, you've got this supply and demand model working, and to say that they should be paid more is not the sort of way of an economist thinking about the question. That's just what they're paid. It's not a should and an ought sort of question. So those are the sorts of values that you get in economics, that we're thinking about markets working, we're thinking about governments intervening, and we're not thinking, well, the value of what this person produces is so high they should be paid a huge wage. So economic tools offer government a way of making policy, and though those decisions are not always easy to sell politically, and this is an example I'd use here is something like the future of the car industry in Australia. So an economist and the Productivity Commission, you can look at on their website, they've got lots of reports, they look at a whole lot of industries, and it's all good economic analysis. They say, well, what are the costs of closing the car industry? What are the benefits? And they might list in the costs things like people in Elizabeth in South Australia, in Broadmeadows, in Melbourne. They're all going to lose their jobs. All the people that work at Ford, people who work at General Motors, the people who work around them, so not those people who are directly employed in the industry, but people who are indirectly employed by the industry, so the automotive part workers, the people that supply retail services in those areas are all going to be affected by what happens to the car industry. So those are big costs. We're going to create some unemployment, and we're going to create, given that we've got a welfare state, we're going to create people collecting unemployment benefits. We're going to create people perhaps retiring early and getting disability pensions and things like that. The benefit of closing the car industry is that most Australians will perhaps be able to buy a cheaper car, and they won't, because there's a small tariff imposed on cars, and they won't be the taxes that were paid that were to support some of the industry programs for the car industry will not be used for those purposes anymore. And once again, we can think there of the idea of opportunity cost. Instead of some program which was designed to support the car industry, we might now have another hospital. So there's an opportunity cost involved. Those are going to be the beneficiaries. But the people who are bearing the costs are concentrated geographically, and they bear substantial costs. The people who benefit from it are dispersed there throughout the whole of Australia, and it might only make a small difference. You know, they might only be a little bit better off by the demise of the car industry. So you've then got the politicians trying to weigh up these costs and benefits, and if we're talking about marginal electorates and things like that, then the politicians are going to respond very strongly to the groups that are concentrated in particular areas. But the economist's job is not really to make the final decision, it's to get together all the evidence. Well, what is the evidence on the costs and the benefits of continuing to support the car industry or deciding to get rid of the car industry? These are, it might also be a different result in the short run and the long run. Today I might lose my job as working for General Motors, but next week I might get an even bigger and better job, engineer let's say I'm an engineer, I might go off and get a job with some sort of highly paid mining firm or whatever, and I might be better off. So we've got to look at what happens in the short run and what happens in the long run. And one of the things that I think is less than satisfactory in some of the economic models is the assumption that all these factors of production, the capital and the labour, will just get reallocated to better uses. It would be nice if that did happen, but it doesn't always happen as easily as some of the models assume. So what I've talked about so far is I've talked about thinking about the monetary costs and the monetary benefits, but there might also be other costs and benefits that are not so easy to quantify. And so one of the arguments was used initially in supporting the car industry about 60 years ago was that it was really important that Australia had a manufacturing capability, because if for defence reasons we had to be able to build a tank or build a fighter jet or something or other, a submarine or whatever, and so having some sort of manufacturing base increased the probability of doing that. This can still be an important thing to try and measure, but it might be really hard to measure it because you don't know. Increasing the security of national security or whatever is a very nebulous idea, and it's not easy to measure. But economists can still try and measure some of these things. And there are lots of examples of this. So for example, in things like workers' compensation cases, economists get dragged into the courts to say, well, what is the value of the pain and suffering that people who have suffered a work injury might be subjected to? We can't quantify. We can try and put a dollar value on losing your leg, but it's not that easy thing to do. But economists still have a go at that. And the environment's another example of something where economists try and put values on, and they call it just the existence value. So I'm sitting here in Canberra, I'm talking to you, but it might make me happy to think there's the Great Barrier Reef up there in Queensland. I might be willing to pay some amount of money to know that it's there. If I want to go and visit it, I might never go and visit it, but for the option of maybe one day visiting it. And economists will find ways of trying to value what people think about the value of something like the Great Barrier Reef or Kosciuszko National Park, which is, I guess, for us something that's more immediate. We do go there. I guess the attitudes that the industry expects and the professional ethics are all because economists are dealing with these issues that are really, they can be very contentious and very socially divisive, and have important implications for individuals' well-being. So I might sit here and say, well, let's close General Motors at Elizabeth. It's not me losing my job. It means a lot to the person who's about to lose their job. So I want to make sure that the models I'm working with, the data I'm using, is the best possible. It's unlikely to be perfect because measuring these things is always really difficult, but I want to make it clear that I'm doing the best I can. And we want to make sure that the models that are being developed, and there are these huge models that are pretty much impenetrable, but the people who are working with them, they work day in, day out with them, and that they're doing the best they can to make sure that those models are accurate, and that they're not letting personal prejudices get in the way of the results. So it's all of that can be really very tricky, and I think you can find yourself arguing from different points of view. I had two of our former students who now work in the Treasury, the Commonwealth Treasury, came to speak to our third year class last year, and one of them had spent 2 years of her life, working life, as part of the team that designed the mining tax. And the other one, he was now helping to write the legislation to repeal the mining tax. So they're both using their economic skills with difference from different political sides of the argument. Professionalism and presentation are really important, because working as an economist, unless you're working in an environment like the Commonwealth Treasury, you're probably not surrounded by economists. So you've got to be able to communicate. And I think one of the things that economists have often done badly is communicating with non-specialists. They've got to be able to explain the concepts that they want to get across in a way that everyone can understand. So learning how to communicate clearly, both in a written and a verbal form, is a really important skill for an economist. And being aware that some of the assumptions you're making about the world will not be the assumptions that other people make. So my example earlier about pay, low pay, well, if you say to a group of healthcare workers, well, that's just supply and demand, bad luck, they might not be wildly receptive and happy to hear you speak. So you need to be able to present your arguments in ways that that will help people to understand where you're coming from, and that's really, really important. I think the attributes you need to develop to be a successful economist are, I think, a real enthusiasm and interest in the area, and an ability to make logical, coherent arguments. You need to be able to spell out your assumptions clearly, and you need to be able to work with data. So learning how to work with data, and it doesn't necessarily have to be at a very sophisticated level. Some people who are economists spend their lives running econometric programs, but some people just need to be able to get out the data and present it in a coherent way. So talking to former students, and we all talk to former students now they come back and talk to us, and they're presenting arguments. So they're looking at things like the gender pay gap, and they need to be able to get out the data on the earnings of men, the earnings of women, the comparison, how it's changed over time. These are the sorts of things that the minister will want to read, not a complicated econometric program result that's sort of almost incomprehensible. So I would recommend a career in economics. I think it's fascinating, and there are many problems that economists are involved in and will continue to be involved in the future. If we look at the census data, the economists, people with economics degrees, are well paid compared to university graduates with a similar length of university degree. And so I would recommend you all the best for your future careers. Thank you.